Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Lawrence Wilkerson. Lawrence Wilkerson is a retired United States Army colonel and former Chief of Staff to United States Secretary of State Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Uh, before we deep dive into a few specific areas I have in mind to discuss with you today, if we could start on a general note about as a former Chief of Staff to United States Secretary of State, how would you read the overall framework of U.S. foreign policy at this moment? For someone from the periphery, it looks like tariffs, sanctions, bullies, deceptions, downright lies, sometimes military threats, and even strikes. But you may have something more to add to it. How would you define U.S. foreign policy at this moment?
I'm tempted to say that I agree with everything you just said in defining it, but I'll try to be a little more complex and a little more, shall we say, American about describing it. I think it is a rough attempt, and I do mean rough. I don't think it's coordinated. I don't think it is across the cabinet. I don't think it's known fully to the president, and all manner of other descriptions of how discombobulated, disconnected, and frantic even it is. But the fundamental purpose of it, which may have changed about 48 hours ago with the new defense release, but the fundamental purpose was to stop the shift of power away from the West, read Washington and its vassal states in Western Europe. I no longer can say vassal states in the Western Hemisphere because we have very few of those. Um, to, to help them, cause them to stop this inexorable flow of power, cultural, military, financial, economic, psychological, you name the component of power, it's all flowing to the east. The magnet is China, now the number one economy in the world. No question in my mind about that. And because of the strategic blunders of this particular administration, but started by the Biden administration, we have lost the most populous country in the world by UN figures, anyway, not by much, but certainly the most populous country in the world, India. And we have also lost because I think Putin has finally made his decision. Russia has always looked both directions. They've always looked west and east because they have a vast territory in the east. But they have recently been rebuffed so many times, and this last time so powerfully with the Ukraine conflict, from entering Europe, from going west, as it were, that now they, I think, have made a purposeful decision to ally with the East. So now we have three-fifths of the world's population, Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi, all against the empire in the West. And the empire in the West is fracturing at the same time. So the foreign policy that just came out, I think, expressed as security policy a couple of days ago, is more reflective, one, of where Trump sort of promised before he was inaugurated to go: America first, America first, America first. And second, a recognition that they're losing. Trump's statement that Beijing and Russia and India, by implication, should enjoy themselves was a statement of fact. He at least intuits that he's lost them, and maybe not going to be able to, through any kind of diplomacy, get them back in a meaningful way. In other words, they're allied against him and against the empire in the West. So we're going to tuck our tail, retrench, and try to dominate the Western Hemisphere. I think the business with Venezuela shows a start of that, but it's been happening for some time in terms of the Western Hemisphere. Now that's going to be the focus, I think. So that's a very convoluted, but I think fairly accurate discussion of a very discombobulated, uncoordinated foreign policy.
If I could pick up on that particular point about the realization on losing power, or at least the sense of challenge that the West is getting from the rest of the world, particularly a specific set of countries from the global South coming together. Um, what confuses me is if there is a realization that there is a significant challenge coming from the other side, rationality would tell you that you would be more careful about building more alliance to break the other side. I mean, by all reason, and I'm thinking about how the relationship between the United States and India has gone recently. I mean, I'm not unhappy about how India-China relationship has forwarded recently. I mean, I've strongly believed that it's not about the United States, it's about the future of Asia, under which we have 2.8 billion people, and these events are often characterized in the West as a result of sanctions and tariff, which I think is completely misleading, which might have added an element of politics to it, but these are much deeper processes that are taking place in Asia, where both sides are realizing that our future lies in development and cooperation, and to indulge in this military conflict or tension for specific set of areas where we have border disputes is unproductive, and that's what these developments are. But anyway, looking from the West, it seems like losing an ally. So my question to you is, I sometimes feel that the West is particularly the Trump administration, is completely deluded about its own power. It seems to me they think that there is no challenge to its power, and that's why it can do anything. It doesn't need allies. It can bully East Asian allies. It can, of course, bully West European allies and so on. So if you could share your thoughts about how does the Trump administration look at its own power? Is it deluded about its own power?
That's a difficult question to answer because I don't think anyone with a right mind can say that the Trump administration has a policy or has a strategy. What they have is a frenetic attempt to navigate some events in the world that I don't think they anticipated, that they had a huge hand in causing, and that they have not a clue about how to react to. That's the long and the short of it, really. We have, let me put it very, very bluntly, we have a very incompetent cabinet and a very incompetent president. And they demonstrate it on a daily basis, domestically as well as internationally. But I think we have seen with what's happened in the last couple of weeks in particular, and also I have to add into this our unparalleled attachment to that genocidal state Israel, which is just turmoiling this country. We probably have a shift, a major shift right now in Americans' feelings about Israel, which were neutral, blase at worst, and very favorable at best. They are now 60% unfavorable and growing. And all of this has been caused by the heavy hand which Trump and Biden before him, to be honest, brought to the support of this genocidal maniac named Bibi Netanyahu, which doesn't seem to want to stop. And he doesn't seem to want to stop. That's perturbating things majorly for them. And then domestically, the Epstein case and other things associated with it, which news breaks almost daily about with new revelations, is causing them real angst inside the administration, because I think they know that if this continues, that Trump is going to come out smelling pretty bad. And if he doesn't already in some circles. So all of these things are combining to make this, as I said before, probably the most disconnected administration. I don't even think they have a national security advisor. Let me back up for a moment. The concept of of government, if you will, in the United States with regard to national security and to a large extent foreign policy was created in the 1948 National Security Act and has been evolving and gaining new measures and new institutions ever since. The latest institution being the National Intelligence Director, which for the first time in our history consolidated all of the intelligence under a single individual, something our Congress never wanted to do before, too much power. They did adumbrate that power in that position by not giving it financial control over the intelligence community or what I would call personnel control. In other words, the current NDI, Tulsi Gabbard, cannot move money around, nor can, and it's billions of dollars we're talking about, nor can she move people around based on expertise and need and so forth. So her power is very, very limited. Nonetheless, the Congress did that. But that instrument, which worked fairly well in the post-World War II era, with the National Security Advisor more or less coordinating what the cabinet did with regard to foreign and security policy, is broken, utterly broken. We have no National Security Advisor. It's as if there is no conductor in front of a vast orchestra. We have Marco Rubio, who thinks he's National Security Advisor, but he's also Secretary of State. And he's quite busy, thank you very much, ruthlessly doing the things that he's doing and has wanted to do for years, like drive Latin America into an insane asylum every day. So he doesn't have time to stretch out and coordinate a vast bureaucracy. So no one's doing it. Not a soul is doing it. What you have is Pete Hegseth at Defense doing his thing, Marco Rubio at State doing his thing, all the other cabinet officers doing their thing, and Trump occasionally calling them together in cabinet meetings, which are not really the way we run our government anymore, but he's returned to them because they give him maximum visibility and he can pontificate and he can say things like, isn't the world beautiful? Isn't America beautiful? Haven't I made it wonderful again? Which he repetitively does. This is a circus of clowns. Trump is in the center ring, Rubio and Hegseth are in the accompanying rings, and the circus goes on to the great detriment of the empire. What should we be doing? We should be recognizing the diminution of power in the West. We should be recognizing the accumulation of power in the East. We should be assembling all the trusted allies we can, some of the ones that we've had all along, Japan, Korea, Western Europe, and even some new ones we might be able to garner in the southern part of the hemisphere, in Latin America, most pointedly Brazil. And I would say a couple of others too. But we're not doing that. And we shouldn't be doing it to retrench. We should be doing it and not to combat this inexorable shift of power, but to accommodate it in the ways that Xi Jinping and others, Putin even from time to time, and Sergei Lavrov from time to time, have said. We need to cooperate, we need to collaborate, and we need to do it in a fundamental sense of strategic economic competition, financial competition, but not military competition, not war, not those other instruments of national power that shouldn't be the front of our attack or our motions in the world today. But that's what we're doing. Sanctions and the military have become the major ingredients of our foreign and security policy. Now, I think this document that's just come out may be changing that a bit, but I don't know until I see the implementation or the beginning of the implementation at least. And retrenchment is not necessarily a bad idea when you have a $30+ trillion aggregate debt and the interest payments on that debt annually are $1 trillion+ and will be $2 trillion within 7 to 8 years, which will negate all of the discretionary spending in the federal budget at present nominal increase. So we're in real trouble financially. We're in real trouble with regard to how we're managing our finances. Go back to Britain when they had the world's transactional and reserve currency, the pound sterling. Go back to the Dutch when they had the de facto currency like that, the guilder, or go back to the Roman Empire, go back to any of the periods when we're not the only country in the world that's ever had the reserve currency and the transactional currency. This is something that sort of accompanies empire. We've got to get off of it ourselves because it's driving us into a fiscal crisis of untoward proportions. It's going to destroy us if we don't get a handle on it. I would suggest were I the Secretary of the Treasury that we do everything we can in the world daily to get rid of the dollar as the transactional and reserve currency and turn it over to China. Now, Xi Jinping's smart enough, he doesn't want it. He does not want it because he knows the Chinese know the history of empire. They know what goes along with the degradation of empire. And one of the things is to have the reserve currency and to abuse it. And that's what all empires have done in the past. Look back at the British in 1956 when Eisenhower forced them out of Suez. You might say that was the last straw in many respects, although they've been trying to live off us ever since. But it essentially was Eisenhower threatening a run on the pound in the IMF. And there's no way Britain could have stood up to that, particularly since they had such a huge war debt. So we're in that situation now. And we need to recognize that and figure out a way to extract ourselves from that situation and Katie bar the door. Whatever we want in the world, whatever the world decides it wants, does it want a gold standard? Does it want a silver standard? Does it want a Bitcoin standard? How does it want to transact its business in the world on a global basis? And maybe China or India or someone in the SCO is going to have to shoulder this burden if we want to continue the same kind of process. I think we need a new process. I really do. And I'll tell you something else I think we need. If you've read Thomas Piketty's books, we probably need some way to devise a global tax on capital. And we need to administer that tax for the benefit of the world and the benefit of individual countries too, of course. But we can't have all this capital wash in the world, much of it in the black economy. I'm told now it might be $15 trillion in the black economy. We can't have it in the world benefiting 1% of the world and the other 99% not benefiting and even hurting because of the concentration of wealth. So we've got to figure out a new system. And we cannot do that if we're retrenched into our own little tent or if we're fighting this transfer of power. We have to accommodate it. The world is a multi-nodal world now, and those nodes are becoming quite apparent. China, India, Russia. China and India, because of their population, because of their breadth, their depth, because it's the number one economy in the world now. Just the stats coming out of China are stunning. 1 million car charging places. We have 1/60th of that in the United States. China has 1 million car charging places across the country. It has high-speed trains that remind me of the one that Paris built down to the Côte d'Azur, but they're all over China. It just is a marvelous economy. I'm stunned every time I go back because it just in 5-year leaps it goes further and further. So we have to accommodate that, and you don't accommodate that by retrenching completely, and you don't accommodate that by challenging it with military force and sanctions. You accommodate it by getting together, as they did at the SCO, and you sit down and you talk about all the things we need to do, not least of which is to fight this climate change crisis and get nuclear weapons back under control, which is what Trump said he wanted to do, what he talked with Putin in Alaska about doing, what Putin agreed that it needed to be done, and even suggested he bring Xi Jinping into the discussions so that in Moscow or Washington or Geneva or wherever, they could sit down with the three principal nuclear powers in the world in terms of weapons and begin to negotiate a new treaty regime and maybe bring the other 6 nuclear weapon states, soon to be 7 maybe, if Iran does what I think they're going to do, into that regime because we have an incredibly dangerous situation right now with nuclear weapons. Not least of which, and I'll end on this, is Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. Because if he starts this war with Iran again, which he is very apt to do, if he does, and the United States comes in or doesn't come in, and Israel's situation is dire, existential even, I fear what Bibi Netanyahu might do with his nuclear weapons. So we have some situations in the world that are fraught with problems right now that are every bit as close at hand, if you will, as they were when the Russians tried to put missiles with nuclear weapons on them in Cuba. Or even more seriously, and I think it was a more serious crisis, we just didn't look at it like we did Cuba because Cuba was in our face in a short period, but it was the crisis over Berlin. You know, when the Germans started with Russian help, Soviet help, to build the Schönmauer, the wall of shame, the Berlin Wall, we helped them because we knew that if that wall didn't go up, the GDR, East Germany, would bleed so many of its citizens that it would become an existential threat to Moscow, to the Soviet Union. And I think that was even more dangerous than Cuba because Cuba was not strategic. Cuba was just an effort to get something out there, call it a tactical effort with strategic weapons, to get something out there closer to the United States. Berlin was, the Soviet Union couldn't afford to lose Berlin. They couldn't afford to lose it. And they were losing the GDR. They were losing the population. I think it was 10,000 a week at the time the wall went up. So we've been there before, but I don't think we are. I think we're actually closer today. We're closer today than the potential for using nuclear weapons. And I'm sad to say that I think that potential is most potent in the empire.
What you have called accommodation about this acceptance in the United States at the imperial core about the changing dynamics in world power relationship. And you have mentioned about the British empires. I personally feel the situation is even more difficult at this point in time. One major point of difference, I would say, is that when the British Empire was declining, the social conditions were not as bad as what it is in the United States at this moment. I mean, to cite Piketty's own work, inequality in Britain at that time, I mean, throughout the first half of the 20th century, actually was falling. Sure, Britain was losing its grip on the periphery, particularly because of rise of the United States and Germany and other powers like Japan. But if you look internally, the labor movement was strong, wages were rising, it was not falling. I mean, all kinds of indicators. In fact, Britain itself was not a debtor nation like the United States at this point in time. Now, you could argue that Britain had traditional colonies from which it's extracted a lot of surplus, but nevertheless, the social conditions were not as desperate. That's number one. And number two, I would add, is that when power was passed from Britain and France to United States, from global South perspective, it was a passing of power within the Western Bloc itself. So to that extent, from our point of view, it was, even though it was a realignment, even though it was a recreation, and of course it was a tremendous moment for the global South with decolonization, et cetera, end of landlordism in a lot of places. I mean, this was a dramatic moment that was brought about by the horrific war. But nevertheless, power essentially didn't change a lot. It transferred from, let's say, London to New York, or, but this time the rising powers come from the opposite camp, if you like, at least insofar as we understand it within that Cold War lens. And that, I think, would make the imperial core more and more desperate in clutching on to their power. And finally, maybe we don't have people like Nixon or Reagan who could say that, well, let's sit down and talk and we can have peace. I don't think the current administration has that foresight, if you like.
I don't disagree with you on that last point, but I would come back to some of the things you said. While the broad sweep of what you said I might agree with, we're still living with some of the after effects of decolonization. One of the most vivid right now is happening in the Levant. That I would put at the feet of the British as much as I would at the present feet of the US administrations, Biden's and Trump's. And every time I think about that, I get angry at the British Empire because they created that. They created that. There was a time in 1947 when the CIA station chief, a very smart individual in Beirut, actually sent a very angry cable back to CIA headquarters. And that cable, in essence, said, "Quit telling me to worry about the Soviets out here. My problem is not the Soviets, it's the damn British." Incidentally, his plane went down a week later and he was killed. But that was you go back and read that cable and you understand the detritus of the British Empire. And it's very much still with us, especially in that region. So it wasn't quite as clean as you might have suggested. And the other aspect of it, I don't know if I agree with or not, is how smoothly the transition took place independent of the rest of the world. Because the United States, while let's take Iran, for example, the Iranian people, especially the Persians amongst them, which at the time was about 60%, I think, probably about 50, 51, 52% today, really saw the United States of America as the new power in the world whom they would learn to love if they didn't already, because they saw us as a decolonization power. They saw us as a power that in World War II had beat all the people who had the colonies and even had caused the allies like Britain to have such problems with their empire that, it wasn't too good to pick up the pieces afterwards, or it was pretty difficult. And of course, 1956 in Suez sort of ramified that. Who was the last U.S. president to tell Israel to get its damn forces out, or they would put troops in and force them out? Eisenhower, the last one. So all that to say that I think there is still a chance with the present construction of empire, and the chance is ebbing away quickly, to respond to, and that's just one example, that feeling in Iran, which is now rapidly dissipating, which was in other places too, Africa too, for example, the whole continent basically, and resurrect some of the feeling, if that's the right term for it, that was present at that time. But I don't see anything like that happening. In fact, what are we doing in Africa? We're bombing people in Somalia repeatedly, I'm told. We're not doing anything that looks even remotely like what the Iranian expectations of the Americans and the ultimate empire that we represented in 1945 promised. We've reneged on all of that promise, more or less. And we've done it with almost the entire world, and are now fast doing it with our allies in Europe, and not doing a real good job with our allies in the Pacific either, particularly Australia, Japan, and Korea. That's my real angst, because if we were smart, if we were intelligent, and we had good leadership, they would pursue strategies that not necessarily tried to resurrect that good feeling about America that existed in 45 and 46, but they would at least start to live up to and do it globally things like international law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, the institutions we've formed, put some more oomph into the Security Council and the UN, quit using it exclusively for our place to vouchsafe and say how sacred Israel is to us. I know domestically how hard that is to do, but I think that's changing right now. I don't know if we'll take advantage of it. But there is a way not to resurrect the empire, not to save the empire even, but to step down from imperialism in a way that is not only conducive to our own health and security, but to the world's, and to accommodate the shift of power and the other side, because they seem to want accommodating. They don't seem to want, I mean, tell me how many wars China's in. Tell me how many countries China has sanctions on. It's just not their way of life. To me, it's not. And I've been in and out of China for 30 years. First time there was in '84. And very different country then, of course. It's stunning now when I go back. And I don't think India wants that either. I don't think India's in too many wars. And it's just settled its problems, I think, or it appears to, with China. And the only thing left is that nasty little piece called Kashmir, and maybe a little ruckus with Bangladesh every now and then. But basically, this is an ASEAN type community. It, I remember vividly when we were trying so hard to get ASEAN to get a security component. We wanted them to have a security component. We wanted ASEAN to turn into NATO East. And they rebuffed us repeatedly. They rebuffed us because they did not want to have a security component. Good for them. Good for them. I think that's sort of the attitude, even though we saw the most incredible display of military precision and might a few days ago by the Chinese, and before that by the Russians. Those were not just done for celebration. They were done essentially to say to the empire in the West, we can take you, but we don't want to. And I think that's China's position. For example, I don't think Taiwan is a problem. I don't anymore. I used to think it was. I don't think it is, because the Chinese are smart enough to know that no one would win a war. They would win the conventional war. And then we go nuclear, and no one would win that. And they're smart enough to know that. So they're not going to use force against Taiwan. I wouldn't say that out loud to the Chinese, and destroy the ambiguity we've created over it. We seem to be wanting to do that. But it's just a different complexion that the SCO, if you will, that seems to be the latest manifestation of it, than the complexion that we have. And the complexion that we have is dire. Now, on your domestic situation, I think it's actually the opposite of what you said in this country right now. And I'm at wit's end to I'm not a domestic economist or anything like that, but I'm at wit's end to try and figure out how to do something about this. I think maybe the Gaza situation may be doing it slowly but surely. What we have in this country is a whole mass of people who are just well enough off to not be really angry. That's what we have. Even though the wealth disparity is the worst it's ever been in our history, the maldistribution of wealth, we still have that. And I'm not even going to say the lower 50%, I'm going to say the lower 75%, because the other 25% and the top 0.001 are so God blessedly rich that you can hardly contemplate. I mean, Elon Musk, a South African, by God, just went over apparently being a trillionaire. But there's so many people who have just enough to exist, and to exist in front of that TV and eat that food and drink those Coca-Colas, that they don't get angry. So we have this mass of people in America who are drugged, who are content to an extent, who may be living from paycheck to paycheck, who can't even afford a home, whatever it might be, but their life has not deteriorated to the point where they would really get angry. And that's a sad situation, because that's what our version of liberal democracy has done. And the rich people, the 0.001%, are the ones who did it and are still doing it and like it that way, and would really love to take AI, robotics, and other associated technologies and make it permanent. Make it permanent. That's what disgusts me about the domestic situation. You can't stir Americans up. These are the people that threw off the most powerful empire in the world with French help. And you can't stir them up to do anything today, except a small minority of them. That's the most difficult thing to look at and think that we can recover, because that's a massive problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure I will link the economic condition to people not being angry about the injustices, particularly when it is happening at a distant place. I mean, one could come back and argue from the opposite side that because people's life are so much tied to their own precarities. And I'm thinking about places like India, from which you can make the same argument that why are Indians not angry about what's going on in Palestine? And of course, part of it is about the same propaganda machine, the mainstream media, what your government says, the whole schooling system, etc., etc. They play much bigger role than I would say the economic ties that you made. I mean, that's my opinion. But for India, you could make the other way around, that people in Indian countryside or Indian slums in the urban, their life is so much intensified and intensive and so much debilitated in a way that it's even hard for people like us to go out there and say that, talk about Gaza. I mean, they would say that we don't have a life here. I mean, what is Gaza in a way? I
Well,
mean, I will not disagree or agree with them, but I'm just making the case. But on the
I,
domestic
I,
economy,
I don't disagree with you with regard to India
yeah,
and
but
other countries too.
I wanted to tie that with the real economic situation in the United States. I mean, if you look at the current data, it's that growth is running at 1.7, 1.8%. Bloomberg had a massive economic survey, the IMF itself, let alone Bloomberg. It says that at best, 2026 and 2027 would have 1.9% aggregate economic growth, with inflation above 3% for 2026 and above 2%, the Fed's target for 2027, and below 2% growth, which is a kind of stagflationary situation. You have unemployment at 4.4%, and on the same hand, you have sticky inflationary situation, which is really putting the Federal Reserve in a bind. And add to that, if you think about the 1%, I mean, there are several studies on that. If you take the AI generated tech, Magnificent Six, Seven, whatever, they are contributing to, I mean, one study at Bloomberg says that they are contributing, adding to 0.6% of growth in the United States. Now, if the overall growth is 1.7, 1.8, and 0.6 is coming from that tiny bit of segment, AI driven stock, then you are literally seeing 1.2%. And now you can think about the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which allows you that fiscal stimulus of the running deficit to 6 to 7%, 10%. And even I might have disagreement about the impact of that fiscal stimulus, but I think most mainstream economists would argue that in the short run, I mean, one can disagree about the long run about the impact of that, but in the short run, definitely that stimulus keeps the growth relatively higher. And I would say that's the kind of difference we are seeing between a country's economy like Germany, where you are getting growth like almost stagnant, literally, like you are getting 3%, 0.3%, 0.4%, as opposed to the United States, where you are having 1.8, 1.9. And that kind of 1.2% of growth differential is coming primarily out of federal government stimulus and spending. So if you look at the real economy, and we can go from sector to sector, like agriculture, industry, the job data, I think the situation is very desperate. Now, this is not to negate the fact, one of your points, that overall, if you compare life in the United States and life in much of the rest of the world, I mean, I'm thinking about the global south, not Europe, life is still better there. But I'm not sure people think in those terms. I don't think someone living in New York or Illinois would think about how people have been struggling in India. They might hear about the stories from their parents and the struggles they might compare from generations to generation. And I think that there has been an intergenerational change there. A generation earlier, life was relatively easy to find a job, to pay your house bills, and now it is desperate. I wonder what your response to my thoughts.
Well, I'm not saying that things aren't negatively aimed. I'm not saying that it might change at any moment. As a matter of fact, I would be one who would predict and I probably wouldn't have done this 5 to 10 years ago, that we're going to fall apart state-wise by state. We're going to fall apart. We're going to find that dismemberment of the United States of America is a not only a possibility, it is a probability. And it's happening right now. It's happening in Texas. It's happening in California. It's happening in Minnesota. It's happening in Wisconsin. It's happening in New York. Um, Big fights, fights I never thought I would see before. And they involve the Constitution significantly. But there's another element I'd want to bring up too that I don't think the rest of the world is that attuned to or even aware of. And it's contained in a book right now called Dark Crusade, which more or less exposes what I would call, the author calls it the third great awakening, but he calls it, I would call it the fourth great awakening. He would call it the third great awakening, does call it that. And what he means by that, what we mean by that in our world, is religious awakening. And what that has done, and it has exacerbated this situation in the Levant, probably more so than any other single factor, even the factor that I always harp on, that Israel is our attack dog. We are not Israel's sugar daddy. Um, and that's dispensationalists, is what the experts call them. I call them fundamentalists. But we have as many as 50 to 65 million people in America. Think about that for a moment, who are looking for the situation in the Levant to produce the rapture, the end times, Armageddon, willingly looking forward to it. They don't care who dies, they don't care who gets killed, as long as it conforms roughly to their script. And their script is from the Old Testament. Their script is, as Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, told Tucker Carlson recently, his guide to national security decision making. And these people have a grip on the government, and they have a particularly acute grip because of Donald Trump, who I don't think for a moment believes this sort of thing, but he's so politically expediently used them that they are now a part of the warp and woof of his administration. I actually saw this in the administration I served, George W. Bush, when he had his meeting with Franklin Graham and the other evangelicals that he brought into the Oval Office. And part of his motivation was to satisfy their wish, because they told him Iraq and then Iran, well, Iraq, then Syria, then Iran, had to go. By that, I mean go down, regime change, in order to follow the biblical script and bring about Armageddon. Now, other people in the world might think, oh, that sounds like something that would come out of a U.S. interpretation of Islam or whatever. It's really maniacal. I'm sorry, it's the truth. We have a significant portion of our population that votes, that has some wealth, and in some cases, great wealth, that has billionaires in it, oligarchs, we would call them, and they all are looking for the rapture, the end times. And they think the script is being followed right now pretty closely. And they don't want any U.S. leader to deviate from that script, which is going to be one of the compellant factors with regard to our helping Israel with regime change in Iran, I think, before Christmas. And all bets are off for the empire if we get bogged down in that battle with 90 million Persians and others in Iran. But that's a dynamic that most people in the world don't even appreciate. They don't know that that's captured a lot of the decision making in our government. At the same time, what you said is true, but it hasn't happened yet in terms of really impacting people at the point where they say, enough already, enough. This has to change. You've got segments doing that. But look at what they've got to turn their minds to. a corrupt Democratic Party and a corrupt Republican Party. There's no political outlet in the United States for this kind of exasperation or rebellion. There simply isn't. So, what do you do at that point? You take to the street, and you ultimately take to the street with guns. I mean, that's Thomas Jefferson said, when you're in trouble with the government, you have the right to remove it. Well, if you have to have guns to remove it, then I think what we're going to do, though, is, as I said before, we're going to fall apart. We're simply going to fall apart. We're going to have one state going one way, another state going another way. There was a book a few years ago called The 9 Nations of North America. The guy had a map in it, too. The author had a map in it. And you had western provinces in Canada allied with the Pacific Northwest. You had southern provinces that allied with one or two of the states in Mexico. And you had others that just went off on their own, whatever. I'm declaring the Republic of New York or whatever. Most people thought it was fantastic, no chance of coming about, but I could see it coming about. I could see the country being dismembered. You would almost want to compare that perhaps to the dismemberment of the Commonwealth when the British Empire went. I mean, I kind of lived through that. I watched some of that happen and had to deal with some of the countries afterwards who didn't want to have anything to do with London, period. Nothing to do with London. That's the way it was with the Kiwis and the Aussies in the beginning. Now they're vassal states of the empire that's in existence, the U.S. empire. But I think it's a more complex situation than many people recognize with regard to our domestic situation. And that religious component is something that I was totally ignorant of until about 10 years ago when it started impacting the armed forces. We have in the armed forces now of the United States of America, as Trump said, the most powerful armed forces in the world, which is bull. We have almost totally evangelical chaplains. Now, you think that might not be much of a statement, but what does that do to Hegseth's ability, for example, which he is implementing right now, to have Christian prayer meetings in the Pentagon every week, to bring pastors into the Pentagon to speak to the rank and file of the military about how women, now women constitute about 20% of my army now, how women shouldn't have the right to vote, how women are only good for having babies. This is Hegseth's pastor. These meetings are taking place weekly in the Pentagon, religious meetings. They want Christianity to be the national religion. This is a huge movement in the United States that most scholars and others just poo-poo. They don't know that much about it, but it is happening. And I've been immersed in it with regard to the military ranks because we're trying to stop it and make sure that separation of church and state remains a fabric of the military. It's dangerous within the military to do this because you also have a lot of people who don't subscribe to this, who are being oppressed really by this having to go to Christian prayer meetings and such. Dangerous thing to be happening in the armed forces. We do not need Christianity as a national religion enforced by the United States military. And that's where these people want to head. And Hegseth is accommodating them as far as I can tell.
And this has spread even outward beyond the North America. I mean, deep influence in Central America in particular, but even South America, the evangelicals, which kind of partially explains why in many countries in Latin America, you get huge support for Israel. I mean, of course, a large segment of the governments in Latin America have been progressive on the Palestine question, and they have condemned the genocide, and they have even come up with concrete measures of sanctions, etc. But they have done it despite some of these tremendous pressures from the domestic evangelical constituents. In fact, one of my friends said that in Nicaragua, he drove in a taxi where there was the Sandinista flag on one hand, and there was the Israeli flag on the other hand. And he was quite confused initially what's going on here, and to figure out that he stands for some of the economic policies of the Sandinista, and he's a member of that. But socially, religiously, he is an evangelical. And for him, the Israeli flag doesn't represent anything that's going on in Palestine necessarily, but his own religious idea that's derived from the biblical notions and so on.
Right. The biblical interpretation that Senator Cruz gave a little bit of revelation to in his interview with Tucker Carlson is simply that Israel is doing God's work by killing the Palestinians, and we need to kill the Iranians too to get to the end times. And something I wasn't aware of, they think that, and this is as old as this movement, which might go back as far as 700-800 years. They think that the Rus, the Russians, are the foot soldiers of the Antichrist. So that explains a lot of. I couldn't explain why so many Americans were just virulent in their hatred of Russia. And this Ukraine conflict has produced that. I knew some of it was because there is a significant Ukrainian population inside the United States, around Chicago, for example, and other places. I knew that was part of it. And there's a significant Polish population too, which you probably know in the United States. And Poland was, it's not any longer, I don't think. They're waking up, but it was very much in that business of supporting Ukraine, to include taking millions of Ukrainian refugees. So I knew that was part of the hatred of Russia. But then I found out that this is the case with these evangelicals. And when you talk to them and you ask them why they hate Russia, it's because they provide the Antichrist with his troops. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, Bollywood or Hollywood couldn't write this script, but it's happening. It's true. And it has a major impact on our foreign policy and security policy.
Let's end with one final question on Israel. I mean, you have given enough indication about how you were reading the situation when you called Israel the attack dog. But just to make it a bit more specific about the so-called negotiations, Donald Trump has recently said that he's coming up with a new plan, which might be groundbreaking and very good for the Palestinians. I think for our viewers, the big divide has been Hamas has been talking about a permanent ceasefire. They are ready to release sections of the hostages initially, and then the rest, with the assurance of Israeli army leaving Gaza and with a permanent uh, peace, while the US-Israeli duo has been arguing about releasing all hostages at one go without assuring a permanent ceasefire, and also evacuating Gaza so that they can go on and pursue their messianic dream. Some people are saying that United States wants a genuine deal there, but it's just Netanyahu and the Israeli lobby that keeps them hostage. Others say that no, the Washington administration itself is driven by all kinds of motivations that Netanyahu and the far right may be. That's the attack dog framework. What's your sense of the relationship between Tel Aviv and Washington? And are these negotiations real negotiations, or are these like for public consumptions, or Washington coming up with statements as if new plans, new negotiations are going on? Are these merely for public consumptions, or is it driven by sections of the domestic constituency who is very restless about what's going on in Gaza? They are genuinely trying to strike at least some optics, which we saw earlier the Biden administration tried to do. I mean, its heart was always with the Zionists, but it wanted to give these optics, given segments of its own constituencies were pushing for more on Gaza.
After I saw the non-paper that Steve Witkoff apparently handed to both parties, I don't know that Hamas got the same copy that Israel got.
They got one copy. I don't know if it's the same
Yeah,
copy, but they got one copy. Yeah.
yeah. My concern is it might be different because that's how treacherous we are. But after seeing that and then understanding precisely what we are trying to do, I think it's difficult with Trump, difficult with the whole administration. I would answer that by using this metaphor, analogy, whatever you want to call it. It's neither. It's really what's going on that exemplifies what I think the answer to your question is. And what I mean by that is this UNGA, this attempt to get the UN General Assembly to receive a letter from Mahmoud Abbas that asked for a UFP, a United for Peace deployment of forces under auspices of the UN General Assembly. So the Secretary General, UN Security Council can't do anything about it. We've done it before, most notably with Arafat in 1988, I think it was. We look at that and we say, and this is where my answer comes in. Oh yeah, we could do that as long as the peacekeepers were French, British, German, and U.S. As long as the peace enforcers, I should say, because this is Chapter 7 type rules, you go in with rules of engagement and you can shoot to kill if you have to. It's not the typical UN deployment under Chapter 6. I may have that backwards, but that's the distinction. What we're doing there is exactly what we want to do in a shorter span with what you just described, this settlement, this peace agreement, this ceasefire, whatever. We're putting the thing that's happening right now, the extinguishing of the Palestinians to the last woman, man, child, you name it, on status quo ante. That is to say, before October 7th, Bibi was doing it. He was doing it slowly but surely. He was doing it in the West Bank, East Jerusalem. He was doing it slowly but surely. I even think he contemplated the Golan Heights further, like he's doing now. So what we're doing, if we deploy that kind of force, if we have this kind of settlement, like you were talking about, is we're stopping the horrible killing way late, stopping the starvation way late, but it's just going back on slow burner. And Netanyahu or whoever replaces him will still do the same thing. The West Bank will turn into Israeli territory, Judea and Samaria. Everything else that they have gained will begin to push out its borders. Jerusalem will be entirely an Israeli city. The mosque will be destroyed and a temple built on top. All of this will happen with the U.S. blessing and with the West blessing. That's all that this kind of settlement will mean, which is why I'm now not so sure I'm in favor of this UNGA deployment of forces. I would be absolutely to stop the killing, but I think you could put a fly in that ointment. You could put a fly in that plan, maybe an ultimate stoppage in that plan by making the peacekeepers, not British, French, German, US, the peacekeepers would be predominantly Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, and they would have the power to stop the killing, the power to feed the people, despite what the empire says or any of its lackeys, and the power to fire on the IDF if necessary. And they're not colonial powers by any stretch of the imagination. They have the power to stay and make sure this didn't happen. Even, as Richard Haas suggested in a piece the other day, my old boss, Richard Haas, get the settlers out of the West Bank. Get them out of the West Bank. Just get out, people. Get back to wherever you came from. You're not staying there. That's the only way that I see a viable two-state solution then being possible, or even a single state that is democratic being possible. It can't be Jewish. It can't be Jewish. And then the power of the womb probably favors the Palestinians. Nonetheless, that's the only way you're ever going to settle this problem. But we're not going to do it because my theory is the right theory. Israel's working for us. We're not working for them. And we want every power in the Gulf region gone as it is presently construed. If they aren't liberal democracies that we bless, read lackeys of the empire. We want them gone. And
Well,
Israel is doing that.
we'll leave it there, Colonel Wilkerson. This was a fascinating conversation. I thought you had something relatively different from many of the conversations you generally tend to have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.